At my sister's wedding, my parents laughed and told everyone, "Don't expect much from her, she's the stingy one in the family." The guests laughed, but I raised my glass. When it was my turn to speak, I revealed exactly what I had paid for that night. Every detail. The room fell silent, and their smiles shattered. The humiliation had started during the rehearsal dinner, but reached its crescendo during the reception toasts. Victoria looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, the one I'd quietly paid for when she'd called me crying about how Mom and Dad couldn't afford the dress of her dreams. James, her groom, seemed genuinely happy, blissfully unaware of the family dynamics that had funded his perfect wedding day. "Before we hear from the maid of honor," Dad had announced into the microphone, his face flushed with champagne and self-satisfaction, "I should warn you all about my eldest daughter, Isabella." The crowd of 200 guests turned to look at me, their faces expectant and amused. "Isabella here is what we lovingly call our penny pincher," Mom chimed in from her seat at the head table, gesturing toward me with her wine glass. "She's always been careful with money, sometimes to a fault, so don't expect any extravagant maid of honor gifts or lavish parties from her." The laughter that rippled through the elegant ballroom felt like knives cutting through my chest. 3 years of therapy had taught me to recognize emotional abuse, but it still stung to watch my parents publicly humiliate me in front of extended family friends, and Victoria's new in-laws who were forming their first impressions of our family dynamics. Now, Dad continued, apparently enjoying his moment in the spotlight. "We love Isabella dearly, but she's always been the practical one. Victoria got the beauty and charm. Isabella got the calculator." More laughter. James's mother raised her eyebrows slightly, clearly wondering what kind of family her son had married into. I'd been clutching my maid of honor speech in my trembling hands, a carefully crafted tribute to Victoria that avoided any mention of the countless ways I'd sacrificed for this family over the past decade. But something snapped as I watched my parents perform their usual routine of building themselves up by tearing me down. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with enough force to make nearby tables turn and look. The action felt surreal, like watching someone else control my body while my mind floated somewhere near the crystal chandeliers that I'd also paid for when the venue's lighting budget had come up short. "Thank you, Mom and Dad, for that lovely introduction," I said, taking the microphone from Dad's surprised hands. "You're absolutely right. I am very careful with money. So careful, in fact, that I keep detailed records of every expense." I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, where I'd been tracking family expenses for years, initially for my own peace of mind, never imagining I'd someday read them aloud to a wedding reception. "Let me share with everyone exactly how stingy I've been lately," I continued, my voice growing stronger as I saw the color drain from my parents' faces. Victoria's wedding dress, $4,000. The reception venue upgrade to include the garden ceremony, $8,000. The premium bar package, $3,000. The string quartet for the ceremony, $1,500. The ballroom had gone completely silent except for the soft classical music playing in the background. James was staring at me with growing confusion, clearly doing mental math about his wedding expenses. The engagement party that you all enjoyed so much last spring, $6,000. Victoria's bridal shower, $2,000. The bachelorette weekend in Napa, $3,500. Should I continue? "Isabella, stop," Victoria whispered from the head table, her face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. "Oh, but I'm just getting started," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite my racing heartbeat. The wedding photography package, $7,000. The videographer, $4,000. The flowers, $6,500. The cake, $1,200. I looked directly at James as I continued. "Your honeymoon suite upgrade in Tuscany, $3,000. The spending money your new wife has in her purse for shopping in Florence, $5,000. James's mouth had fallen open. He was staring at Victoria, who was now crying. Whether from embarrassment or rage, I couldn't tell. "Grand total for tonight's celebration of love," I announced to the stunned crowd, $78,400, all paid for by your friendly neighborhood penny pincher. I set the microphone down on the head table and looked at my parents, who were sitting frozen in their chairs like deer caught in headlights. "So you're right, Mom and Dad. I am stingy. I'm so stingy that I've been paying for everyone else's happiness, while you tell strangers that I'm too cheap to contribute to my own sister's wedding." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. 200 guests sat motionless, their champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips, their faces reflecting shock, embarrassment, and growing understanding of what they just witnessed. I smiled at the crowd, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone." The bar is open until midnight, courtesy of the stingy sister. The pattern had started 5 years earlier when Dad's construction business went under during the recession, though I wouldn't understand the full scope of the deception until much later. What began as temporary help with groceries and utility bills had gradually evolved into complete financial dependence that my parents had managed to disguise as my personal choice to be overly generous. I was 28 then, working as a senior software engineer at a tech startup that had recently gone public, earning more money than I'd ever imagined possible. When Dad had called me that first time, his voice thick with shame and desperation, explaining that the business was failing and they were behind on the mortgage, I'd immediately offered to help. Just until we get back on our feet, he'd promised, accepting my check for $8,000 with tears in his eyes. Isabella, you're saving our home. We'll pay you back with interest as soon as the business recovers. But the business never recovered. Instead, Dad filed for bankruptcy 6 months later, and Mom's part-time job at the local boutique became their only official source of income. What they hadn't told me was that Mom had also developed a serious shopping addiction that she was funding through a complex web of credit cards and personal loans. The second request came during Thanksgiving dinner, delivered between courses with the casual tone of someone asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "Izzy, sweetie," Mom had said, using the childhood nickname that always preceded a favor. "We're having a tiny cash flow problem. The insurance premium on the house is due, and we're just a little short this month." "How short?" I'd asked, already reaching for my checkbook. $3,000? We'll pay you back next month when Dad gets that consulting contract." The consulting contract never materialized, and next month brought a new crisis. Victoria's college tuition payment, car repairs, property taxes, medical bills from Dad's mysterious health issues that never seemed to require actual medical treatment when I offered to accompany him to appointments. Each request was presented as an emergency, a temporary setback that would be resolved soon. Each payment was accompanied by elaborate expressions of gratitude and promises of repayment that grew more vague over time. What I failed to recognize was how my willingness to help had gradually transformed me from generous daughter to family ATM. "You're so good with money, Isabella," Mom would say whenever I tried to suggest they create a budget or seek financial counseling. "We're just not as naturally frugal as you are. Some people have that gift, and some people don't." The narrative they'd constructed was brilliant in its simplicity. I was naturally good with money and naturally generous, so helping them wasn't sacrifice but character expression. They weren't taking advantage of me. They were simply accepting my generous nature while acknowledging their own financial limitations. Meanwhile, I was living in a studio apartment and driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic while paying the mortgage on their 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. I'd stopped contributing to my retirement account to free up cash flow for their expenses. I'd canceled my gym membership, stopped eating out, and learned to make a grocery budget of $50 stretch for 2 weeks. "Isabella's always been the responsible one," Dad would tell people at family gatherings, as if financial responsibility was a personality trait I'd been born with rather than a skill I'd developed out of necessity. "She's got that accountant mindset, saves every penny, plans for everything." What they didn't mention was that I was saving every penny because I was supporting 2 households on 1 income. I was planning for everything because I'd become the sole source of financial stability for 4 adults, including Victoria, who'd moved back home after college and was finding herself through a series of unpaid internships at art galleries and wellness centers. The irony was that my frugality, which they mocked publicly while privately depending on it, was the only thing keeping them from complete financial ruin. I was eating ramen noodles for dinner so they could maintain their middle-class lifestyle. I was working overtime and freelance projects, so Victoria could pursue her passion for abstract photography. By the time Victoria got engaged to James, a genuinely nice guy from a wealthy family who probably could have afforded the wedding himself, the pattern was so established that no one questioned why all the wedding expenses fell to me. Victoria simply assumed I'd pay. Mom and Dad assumed I'd pay. And I'd become so conditioned to saying yes that I didn't even consider the possibility of saying no. The wedding planning had been particularly surreal. Victoria would call me with updates about decisions she'd made, the more expensive venue, the upgraded catering package, the destination bachelorette party, and I'd dutifully transfer money while listening to her complain about my boring lifestyle choices. "I don't know how you live in that tiny apartment," she'd said during one particularly tone-deaf conversation about her wedding registry. I'd go crazy without space to entertain. "Thank God James and I found this perfect house. It's going to be so much better for hosting family dinners." The house she was referring to had required a $20,000 down payment that she'd somehow assumed I'd provide, just as I'd provided everything else for the past 5 years. Victoria had never worked a full-time job in her life, but she possessed an uncanny ability to make her unemployment seem like a noble pursuit, rather than extended adolescence funded by someone else's labor. At 26, she described herself as an artist and wellness advocate, which translated to taking expensive yoga teacher training courses and selling occasionally pieces of abstract photography through an Instagram account with 300 followers. "I'm building my brand," she'd explain whenever anyone asked about her career plans, gesturing vaguely with hands that had never been calloused by manual labor or stained by anything more challenging than acrylic paint. "You can't rush creative authenticity. The universe will provide when the time is right." The universe, it turned out, looked a lot like her older sister's bank account. Victoria's relationship with money was fascinating to observe from an anthropological perspective, though significantly less amusing when you were the one funding her lifestyle experiments. She viewed financial support as her natural due, like sunshine or gravity, environmental conditions that simply existed without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement. When she'd announced her engagement to James, her first concern hadn't been planning a life together or discussing compatibility. It had been securing a venue that would photograph well for her social media presence. "Isabella, you have to see this place," she'd gushed, calling me from the country club where she'd gone for a tour without checking on availability or pricing. "It's absolutely perfect. There's a rose garden for the ceremony, and this amazing ballroom with crystal chandeliers. The wedding coordinator says we need to put down a deposit today to hold the date." "How much is the deposit?" I'd asked, already knowing I'd be the one providing it. "Only $5,000. And the venue fee is just $30,000 for the whole day. It's actually a bargain when you consider what we're getting." Victoria had never seen $30,000 in one place at one time, but she discussed wedding budgets with the confidence of someone who'd been managing substantial finances for decades. Her version of just $30,000 was delivered with the same casual tone other people might use to describe a $30 dinner. "I've been researching photographers," she'd continued, apparently taking my silence as consent to continue planning. "There's this amazing artist who shoots for celebrities. Her work is so dreamy and romantic. She's expensive, but Isabella, this is my one wedding. We can't go cheap on the memories." The photographer's expensive package was $8,000, not including travel fees or the additional $2,000 for engagement photos that Victoria considered essential for their save-the-date cards. The save-the-date cards themselves were another $600 for custom calligraphy and hand-pressed paper. "James's family has money," Victoria had confided during one of our wedding planning sessions, "but I don't want them to think I'm marrying him for financial security. I want to prove that our family can contribute equally to the wedding." Our family's equal contribution came entirely from my checking account, but Victoria seemed to have genuinely convinced herself that my money was family money, that my financial success belonged to all of us, rather than being the result of my individual effort and sacrifice. The entitlement wasn't limited to wedding expenses. Victoria had been treating me as her personal funding source for years, with requests that had grown increasingly elaborate and shameless over time. "Isabella, I need to ask you for a huge favor," she'd said 6 months before the engagement, calling me at work with the breathless urgency she reserved for fashion emergencies. "There's this amazing retreat in Costa Rica. It's focused on creative awakening and spiritual entrepreneurship. The woman who runs it is basically the guru of conscious business building. How much is the retreat?" I'd asked, already mentally calculating how much overtime I'd need to work to cover whatever amount she was about to request. "It's an investment in my future," Victoria had replied, a phrase she'd learned from the self-help podcasts that constituted her primary source of life guidance. $7,000 for 2 weeks, but Isabella, this could completely transform my career trajectory. I'll finally have the clarity I need to monetize my artistic vision. The Costa Rica retreat had yielded Instagram photos of Victoria meditating on beaches and journaling in hammocks, but no discernible increase in her income or clarity about career direction. She'd returned with a renewed commitment to authentic living, and a belief that her financial struggles were the result of limiting beliefs about abundance, rather than a complete lack of effort towards self-sufficiency. "Money is just energy," she'd explained to me over lunch at an expensive raw food restaurant that she'd chosen and expected me to pay for. "When you operate from scarcity consciousness, you actually repel prosperity. That's why I'm learning to trust the universe to provide what I need." I'd wanted to point out that the universe was providing what she needed through my software engineering salary and 60-hour work weeks, but Victoria had developed an impressive ability to become tearfully offended whenever anyone suggested she might want to contribute financially to her own life. "I know my lifestyle doesn't look conventional," she'd continued, picking at her $40 salad. but not everyone is meant to work in corporate environments. Some of us are here to hold space for beauty and creativity in the world. What my family never knew, because they'd never bothered to ask, was that I'd been hiding my own financial crisis for the past year. The tech startup that had made me wealthy on paper had been hemorrhaging money in reality, and the stock options that comprised 60% of my compensation package had become worthless when the company failed to secure its next round of funding. My salary had been cut by 40% in January, followed by another 20% reduction in May, but I'd continued sending the same monthly payments to my parents while quietly liquidating my savings account and borrowing against my 401k to maintain the fiction that I was still the family's financial savior. I'd been too ashamed to tell them about the pay cuts, partly because I'd grown attached to their perception of me as successful and stable, but mostly because I was terrified of what would happen to them if I stopped providing support. Dad's health problems had worsened over the past year, real ones this time, not the mysterious ailments that had previously coincided with requests for money, and Mom's shopping addiction had escalated to the point where she was hiding packages from online purchases like an alcoholic hiding bottles. The morning of Victoria's wedding, I'd checked my bank balance and seen exactly $847 in my checking account. My credit cards were maxed out, my savings account was empty, and I had a student loan payment due the following week that I couldn't afford to make. I'd spent $78,400 on Victoria's wedding while sitting on the edge of personal bankruptcy, but I'd also been hiding something else from my family, something that made their treatment of me feel even more cruel. I'd been diagnosed with endometriosis 6 months earlier, and the medical treatments I needed to preserve my fertility were expensive and not fully covered by insurance. Each month, I was spending $1,500 on hormonal treatments and specialist appointments, money that came directly out of the budget I would have used for food and housing. I'd been losing weight because I couldn't afford groceries after paying for Victoria's wedding expenses and my medical care. I'd developed chronic insomnia from financial stress and physical pain, but I couldn't afford the time off work for adequate treatment. The most heartbreaking part was that I'd always imagined my family would be my support system if I faced a serious health crisis. I'd pictured them rallying around me the way families did in movies, offering emotional comfort and practical help while I navigated a scary medical situation. Instead, I was funding their lifestyle while quietly managing a health condition that might affect my ability to have children, without anyone in my family even knowing I was sick. They'd been so focused on extracting money from me that they'd never noticed I'd lost 20 pounds, developed dark circles under my eyes, or started taking frequent sick days for medical appointments. "You look tired lately," Mom had mentioned in passing during one of her calls about wedding expenses. "You should take better care of yourself, Isabella. All that computer work isn't good for your posture." The concern lasted exactly as long as it took her to transition into her real reason for calling. Victoria needed another $2,000 for wedding favors that nobody would remember, but that were apparently essential for the aesthetic she was trying to achieve. I'd started seeing a therapist in March, using my employee assistance program to get 6 free sessions before I'd have to pay out of pocket for continued treatment. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the first person in years to listen to my problems without immediately offering solutions that required me to give more money to other people. "Isabella, can you tell me why you feel responsible for your family's financial well-being?" she'd asked during our second session. The question had made me cry for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. I'd been supporting my family for so long that I'd forgotten there was ever a choice involved. Their financial crises had become my financial crises. Their dreams had become my obligations. And somewhere along the way, I'd lost track of my own goals and needs. "They need me," I'd replied, which was the answer I'd been giving myself for 5 years. "What do you need?" Dr. Chen had asked in response. I'd sat in silence for almost 10 minutes, trying to remember the last time anyone had asked me that question. When was the last time my own needs had been prioritized over someone else's wants? When was the last time I'd made a decision based on what would make me happy, rather than what would solve someone else's problem? "I need to stop bleeding money," I'd finally answered. "But I also need to not feel like a terrible person for wanting to keep my own paycheck." Dr. Chen had helped me understand that healthy families didn't operate the way mine did, that love shouldn't require financial sacrifice, and that being generous didn't mean being exploited. But understanding the dysfunction intellectually was different from finding the courage to change it practically. The wedding speech had been my first real attempt at setting a boundary, though I'd done it in the most public and dramatic way possible, instead of having private conversations like Dr. Chen had suggested. The roots of our family's dysfunction stretched back to my childhood, though I'd only recently begun to understand how early the patterns of manipulation and financial exploitation had been established. Growing up, I'd been the responsible one, not by choice, but by necessity. thrust into a caretaking role that should never have belonged to a child. Dad's relationship with money had always been complicated by his relationship with gambling, though the family mythology painted his financial problems as a result of bad luck in business rather than poor judgment at poker tables and racetracks. When I was 12, Dad's business trips to Las Vegas had become monthly occurrences, and Mom had started asking me to help her figure out why there was never enough money for groceries, despite Dad's claims of increasing income from his construction business. "Isabella, you're so good with numbers," Mom had said, handing me bank statements and credit card bills when I should have been doing homework. "Can you help Mommy understand where all our money is going?" Even at 12, I could see that Dad was withdrawing large amounts of cash regularly, and that our family's expenses far exceeded our income. But instead of confronting Dad about his gambling problem, Mom had enlisted me as her financial advisor and emotional support system, making me complicit in family secrets I was too young to understand. "This has to stay between us," Mom had warned me repeatedly. "Daddy is under a lot of stress with work, and we don't want to make him feel worse by questioning his decisions." By the time I was 15, I was managing the family budget for my after-school job at a local grocery store, depositing my paychecks into the family account and creating elaborate spreadsheets to track expenses and identify areas where we could cut costs. My weekend job had ostensibly been to save money for college, but the reality was that my income was subsidizing Dad's gambling losses and Mom's inability to say no to his increasingly desperate requests for emergency funds. Victoria, 3 years younger, had been carefully shielded from all financial discussions and responsibilities. While I was working and worrying about mortgage payments, she was taking dance classes and art lessons that I was indirectly funding through my contribution to the family finances. "Victoria is more sensitive than you are," Mom had explained, when I'd asked why my sister didn't have to work or help with household expenses. "She needs to focus on developing her creative talents. You're naturally more practical. Money management comes easily to you." Lydia. The narrative that I was naturally good with money had been useful for my parents because it reframed my sacrifices as personal fulfillment rather than family obligation. If I was naturally frugal and naturally generous, then asking me to support the family financially wasn't taking advantage. It was simply allowing me to express my authentic nature. Mom's shopping addiction had developed gradually, starting as retail therapy to cope with the stress of Dad's gambling and escalating into a full-blown compulsion that she funded through credit cards, personal loans, and eventually direct requests for money from me, but she'd managed to disguise her addiction as aesthetic investment and family care. "I bought this beautiful tablecloth for family dinners," she'd say, showing me her latest purchase from an expensive home goods store. "And this gorgeous serving set will be perfect for holidays. I know it seems like a lot, but Isabella, creating a beautiful home environment is an investment in family memories." The beautiful home environment was indeed lovely, but it was funded entirely by my overtime hours and freelance work. Every family dinner served on Mom's expensive dishes was a reminder of how my labor was being converted into their lifestyle, while I ate frozen dinners alone in my studio apartment. Dad's gambling had eventually evolved into more sophisticated forms of financial irresponsibility. He'd started day trading with money he couldn't afford to lose, convinced that his construction experience gave him insight into real estate investment trusts and home-building stocks. When those investments failed, he'd borrowed money to invest in cryptocurrency, certain that his late entry into digital currency would somehow yield different results than his previous get-rich-quick schemes. "Isabella, I need to show you something exciting," he'd said 6 months before Victoria's wedding, calling me over to his computer to see his latest trading platform. "I've been studying Bitcoin patterns, and I think I've identified a strategy that could make us all wealthy." "Dad, have you been gambling again?" I'd asked, though I already knew the answer from his defensive body language. "This isn't gambling, sweetheart. This is educated investing based on market research and technical analysis. I've been watching videos from very successful traders who explain exactly how to minimize risk while maximizing returns." The educated investing had lost him $8,000 in 2 weeks, money he'd borrowed against the house without telling Mom. But instead of acknowledging that he had a problem with financial decision-making, he'd asked me to help him get even by providing funds for what he promised would be a more conservative investment strategy. Victoria's wedding planning had taken place against this backdrop of ongoing financial chaos, but she'd been so focused on her aesthetic vision that she'd never questioned where the money was coming from or whether the family could actually afford her elaborate celebration. The financial impact of supporting my family extended far beyond the wedding expenses I'd revealed in my speech. Over 5 years, I'd transferred $347,000 from my various accounts to cover their living expenses, emergency requests, and lifestyle maintenance. money that represented not just my income, but my entire financial future. I'd started keeping detailed records after the first year, initially as a way to track loans I naively believed would be repaid, but eventually as documentation of a pattern that had spiraled completely out of control. The spreadsheet on my laptop contained 247 individual transactions, ranging from small emergency payments of a few $100s to large transfers that had wiped out months of my savings. The largest single payment had been $45,000 in January, when Dad's gambling debts had finally caught up with him, and he'd received threats from creditors that Mom had described as misunderstandings about payment schedules. I'd liquidated my emergency fund and borrowed against my retirement account to prevent what Dad claimed would be the loss of their house, though I later discovered he'd been exaggerating the timeline and severity of the consequences to create urgency. But the house payments were just the beginning. Over 5 years, I'd paid for Mom's shopping addiction, $67,000 in credit card debt that she'd accumulated buying furniture, clothes, and home decor items that she'd convinced herself were investments in family well-being. The credit card statements revealed purchases from high-end department stores, online boutiques, and home improvement centers, often multiple transactions per day during her worst periods. Victoria's education and living expenses, $43,000 for her college tuition, textbooks, housing, meal plans, study abroad program in Italy, post-graduation photography equipment, yoga teacher training certification, life coaching courses, and monthly allowance during her career exploration phase. Dad's business losses, $89,000 to cover failed investments, gambling debts, and the costs of closing his construction company, including legal fees, outstanding invoices to subcontractors, and equipment loans that he'd personally guaranteed. Family medical expenses, $31,000 for Dad's legitimate health issues, Mom's cosmetic dental work, Victoria's therapy sessions after a bad breakup, and family health insurance premiums that had increased dramatically when Dad lost his business coverage. Cars and transportation, $28,000 for car payments, insurance, repairs, and replacements when their vehicles became too expensive to maintain, including the down payment on Victoria's graduation gift BMW that she'd insisted was necessary for her professional image. Home maintenance and improvements, $44,000 for roof repairs, HVAC replacement, kitchen renovation, bathroom updates, and landscaping projects that Mom had convinced herself would increase the house's value while creating a more beautiful living environment. The most painful category was miscellaneous lifestyle expenses, $45,000 for family vacations, holiday celebrations, restaurant meals, entertainment, and the countless small indulgences that my family had grown accustomed to funding through my guilt and their manipulation. What made the financial exploitation particularly cruel was how they'd managed to make me feel guilty for being concerned about money while they spent my savings on items that were purely discretionary. Victoria's bachelorette party in Napa had cost $3,500 for 3 days of wine tasting, spa treatments, and luxury accommodations. But when I'd suggested a less expensive destination, she'd accused me of trying to ruin her last hurrah before marriage. "Isabella, this is my only bachelorette party," she'd said with tears in her eyes. "I know you think I'm being extravagant, but some experiences are worth more than money. Can't you just be happy for me instead of always worrying about costs?" The implication was that my concern about spending $3,500 on a weekend trip was evidence of my character flaw, an inability to prioritize relationships over money, rather than a reasonable response to being asked to fund luxury experiences I couldn't afford for myself. Similarly, when I'd questioned the necessity of hiring a professional videographer for the wedding, in addition to the photographer, Mom had suggested that my frugality was rooted in jealousy rather than financial reality. "Maybe you're having trouble being generous about Victoria's wedding because you're feeling left behind," she'd said with the concerned tone she used when she was being particularly manipulative. "It's natural to feel envious when your younger sister gets married first. But Isabella, that doesn't mean you should take it out on her by being stingy about her special day." The gaslighting had been so consistent and sophisticated that I'd actually started to believe their version of events, that I was naturally tight with money, that my concerns about expenses were character flaws rather than reasonable financial boundaries, and that being a good sister and daughter required unlimited financial sacrifice. Even now, sitting in my car outside the wedding venue after delivering my devastating speech, I felt guilty for embarrassing them publicly, despite having just revealed that I'd been supporting them financially for years, while they told everyone I was too cheap to contribute to family celebrations. The wedding guests would go home tonight, talking about what they'd witnessed, but none of them would understand the full scope of what I'd been carrying alone. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was chaos wrapped in the polite veneer of a formal wedding reception. Guests who had been laughing at my parents' jokes about my stinginess now sat in uncomfortable silence, their champagne glasses forgotten as they processed the financial reality I'd exposed. Victoria had fled to the bridal suite with her new mother-in-law trailing behind, while James stood frozen at the head table, clearly trying to understand how his wedding had been funded by his wife's sister's financial sacrifice. Mom and Dad remained seated, their faces cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and panic, as they realized that their carefully constructed narrative about family dynamics had just been demolished in front of 200 witnesses. The string quartet continued playing soft classical music, creating a surreal soundtrack for a social disaster that would be discussed in family circles for years to come. "Isabella, we need to talk," Dad said, his voice low and urgent as he approached me near the bar where I'd retreated after my speech. "You've embarrassed the entire family with this display. We can discuss our financial arrangements privately, but airing family business in public is completely inappropriate." The word arrangements struck me as particularly telling, as if the systematic extraction of my income over 5 years had been a mutual agreement rather than gradual exploitation disguised as family loyalty. "What's inappropriate?" I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, "is telling a room full of people that I'm too stingy to contribute to my sister's wedding when I paid for every aspect of this celebration." "You didn't pay for everything," Mom interjected, joining us with the determined expression she wore when reality contradicted her preferred version of events. "Your father and I have contributed too. We've been planning this wedding for months, handling all the coordination and emotional labor while you just wrote checks." The casual dismissal of $78,400 as just writing checks perfectly encapsulated how my family had learned to minimize my contributions while maximizing their sense of victimhood when I failed to be sufficiently grateful for the opportunity to fund their lifestyle. "What emotional labor?" I asked. Calling me with updates about decisions Victoria had already made and bills that needed to be paid. "Isabella, you're being deliberately cruel," Mom replied, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used whenever someone challenged her behavior. "We've always appreciated your help, and we've never demanded anything from you. You offered to contribute because you love this family." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. I'd offered to contribute the same way drowning people offer to accept life preservers, as a desperate response to manufactured emergencies that required immediate financial solutions. James appeared beside us, his formal demeanor barely containing what looked like growing anger. "I need to understand something," he said, addressing my parents directly. "Did you know Isabella was paying for our wedding expenses? Because Victoria and I discussed our budget extensively, and she told me her family was contributing equally to mine." The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. James's family had indeed contributed to the wedding. His parents had paid for the rehearsal dinner, the flowers, and their portion of the guest accommodations. They'd assumed Victoria's family was making similar contributions, not that one family member was secretly funding the entire celebration. "Victoria wasn't lying," Dad said carefully, apparently trying to navigate between protecting his daughter's reputation with her new husband and acknowledging the financial reality I'd exposed. "Isabella is part of our family, so when she contributes, it's a family contribution." "But you told everyone tonight that she was too stingy to help with the wedding," James pointed out, his voice growing sharper. "You made jokes about her being cheap while she was paying for everything. That doesn't sound like someone who was participating in family financial planning." I watched my parents struggle to find an explanation that would preserve their credibility with their new son-in-law, while avoiding full acknowledgement of how they'd been treating me. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain their version of events was impressive in its complexity. "There's been a misunderstanding," Mom said finally, apparently settling on vague confusion as her defense strategy. "Isabella is very generous, but she's also private about money. We thought she preferred not to have her contributions acknowledged publicly." "Is that true?" James asked, turning to me directly. "Did you ask them not to mention your financial contributions?" "No," I replied honestly. "I asked them to stop telling people I was stingy when I was paying for their lifestyle, but they continued anyway." James was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of learning that his new in-laws had been systematically lying about the family member who'd made his wedding possible. "Victoria needs to know about this conversation," he said finally. "She needs to understand what's actually been happening in her family and how it affects our marriage going forward. Please don't drag Victoria into this mess, Mom pleaded. She's had such a beautiful day, and she's so happy. Can't we discuss these issues after the honeymoon? But James was already walking toward the bridal suite, his stride determined, and his jaw set in a way that suggested the reckoning I'd started with my speech was far from over. I found Victoria in the hotel's bridal suite 2 hours later, still wearing her wedding dress, but with her carefully styled hair falling loose around her shoulders and her makeup streaked from crying. James was sitting in the chair across from her, his bow tie undone and his expression grim, while his mother had diplomatically retreated to give them privacy for what was clearly a difficult conversation. "Isabella," Victoria said when she saw me in the doorway, her voice thick with a mixture of anger and devastation. "James told me what Dad and Mom have been saying about the wedding expenses. Is it true that you paid for everything?" I sat down on the edge of the bed, noting how different Victoria looked without her usual confident smile. Smaller, younger, and genuinely confused in a way that suggested she was just beginning to understand the financial dynamics that had shaped our family for years. "Yes," I said simply. "I've been supporting the family financially for 5 years, including all the wedding expenses. Mom and Dad have been telling people I'm stingy while asking me for money several times a month." Victoria stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "But they told me they were paying for the wedding. When James and I were discussing the budget with his parents, Mom said they'd already set aside money for everything. She showed me bank statements." "What bank statements?" "Statements showing deposits and transfers that she said were wedding savings. She had printouts with dates and amounts that corresponded to all our major expenses." I felt a chill of recognition as I realized the scope of my parents' deception. They'd been showing Victoria bank statements that documented my transfers to their account, but presenting them as evidence of their own wedding savings, rather than acknowledgement of my financial contributions. "Victoria, those deposits were money I transferred to their account to pay for your wedding expenses. Mom and Dad have been using my contributions to maintain the illusion that they were financially responsible for the celebration." "That's impossible," Victoria said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Why would they lie about something like that?" James answered before I could. "Because they've been taking credit for Isabella's generosity while publicly mocking her for being stingy. It's a perfect scam. They get to look like generous parents while avoiding any financial responsibility for their claims." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, apparently trying to reconcile the version of events she'd believed with the financial reality that was emerging. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "Isabella, if you've been paying for everything, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe Mom and Dad were handling the wedding expenses?" The question revealed how completely Victoria had been insulated from the family's financial dysfunction. She genuinely didn't understand that she'd been raised in a bubble of financial fantasy, that I'd been funding through my labor, while being portrayed as too selfish to contribute to family happiness. "Because every time I tried to discuss money with this family, I was told I was being petty and materialistic," I replied. "When I suggested less expensive options for wedding planning, you accused me of trying to ruin your special day. When I asked Mom and Dad to create a budget, they said I was obsessing over money instead of focusing on family relationships. But Isabella, I had no idea you were actually paying for everything." If you'd known, what would you have done differently?" I interrupted, genuinely curious about her answer. "Would you have chosen a less expensive venue? Would you have skipped the destination bachelorette party? Would you have bought a cheaper dress?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing that she didn't have a good answer. The truth was that she'd been perfectly comfortable accepting expensive wedding planning as long as she believed someone else was paying for it. Learning that the someone was me rather than our parents didn't change the fundamental entitlement of her expectations. "This is all my fault," James said suddenly, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have insisted on more transparency about wedding finances. My parents asked several times about how costs were being split, and I just repeated what Victoria told me about your family's contributions. This isn't your fault," I said firmly. "You were lied to by people who had 5 years of practice in financial deception." Victoria was lied to as well, though she benefited from the lies in ways that make her complicity more complicated. "I didn't know I was being complicit," Victoria protested. "I thought Mom and Dad were paying for the wedding, because that's what they told me. I thought you were being stingy because that's what they said about you at family dinners and holidays. Did you ever question why I was supposedly too cheap to contribute to your wedding but generous enough to pay for your college tuition, your post-graduation living expenses, and your various career exploration phases?" Victoria's face flushed, as she apparently realized that the financial inconsistencies in my behavior should have raised questions she'd never thought to ask. "I thought those were different," she said weakly. I thought you helped with education and emergencies but didn't want to spend money on celebrations. Victoria, your bachelorette party cost more than most people spend on emergencies. Your wedding dress cost more than many people make in a month. At what point did it occur to you to wonder whether these expenses were reasonable or sustainable? I thought we could afford it, Victoria replied, but her voice suggested she was beginning to understand that affordability had never been part of the equation. 3 days after the wedding, I was finally going through the paperwork I'd avoided confronting for months. Medical bills, loan statements, and financial documents that documented the true scope of my family's exploitation. That's when I found the folder hidden behind my tax records, containing documents that would shatter everything I thought I understood about my identity and my relationship with the people who'd been calling themselves my family. The folder contained adoption papers dated 28 years earlier, along with my original birth certificate listing different parents, medical records from my early childhood, and correspondence between social services and the people I'd called mom and dad my entire life. According to the documents, my biological parents had died in a car accident when I was 6 months old, and I'd been placed with Margaret and Richard Chen as an emergency foster placement that had eventually become adoption. But the most devastating discovery was a series of financial documents showing that my biological parents had left me a substantial inheritance, $400,000 in a trust fund that was supposed to be transferred to me on my 21st birthday. Instead, the Chens had been appointed as trustees and had been systematically withdrawing money from my inheritance for their own expenses over the past 7 years. The trust fund statements told a story of methodical theft, disguised as family financial management. Regular withdrawals of $3,000 to $5,000 per month had been documented as beneficiary living expenses and educational support, but the money had actually funded the Chen's lifestyle, while I worked multiple jobs and lived in poverty to support what I'd believed was my biological family. My hands shook as I read through bank statements showing that my inheritance had been reduced from $400,000 to less than $50,000, with the remaining funds scheduled to be completely depleted within the next year based on their current withdrawal rate. The family I'd been sacrificing for had been stealing from me while making me feel guilty for not being generous enough. But there was more. Medical records showed that I'd been born Isabella Morrison, not Isabella Chen, and that my biological parents had been software engineers who'd specifically established the trust fund to ensure their daughter would have financial security if something happened to them. They died believing they were providing for my future, never imagining that their choice of emergency guardians would result in their daughter being exploited and emotionally abused. The adoption papers revealed that the Chens had originally been temporary foster parents, selected because Margaret was a distant cousin of my biological mother. The arrangement was supposed to last only until permanent adoptive parents could be found, but the Chens had petitioned to adopt me themselves, claiming they'd developed strong emotional bonds with me during the fostering period. What the papers didn't say, but what I could infer from the timeline, was that the Chens had learned about my inheritance during the fostering process and had decided that adopting me would provide them with access to financial resources they couldn't obtain any other way. They'd spent 28 years positioning themselves as my loving family, while systematically stealing my inheritance and making me feel obligated to provide additional financial support. The cruelest irony was that the money I'd been giving them, the $347,000 I'd transferred from my own earnings, was roughly equivalent to what they'd stolen from my inheritance. I'd been working myself into debt to replace money that had belonged to me in the first place. I called the attorney, whose name was listed on the trust fund documents, a woman named Patricia Williams, who'd apparently been trying to reach me for months. According to her secretary, Ms. Williams had been sending certified letters to my parents' address, requesting meetings about the trust fund management, but the Chens had been intercepting the correspondence to prevent me from learning about the inheritance. Ms. Morrison, Patricia Williams said when she called me back 20 minutes later, I've been trying to reach you for over a year. There are serious irregularities in how your trust fund has been managed, and we need to discuss your legal options immediately. What kind of irregularities? Unauthorized withdrawals, falsified documentation of expenses, and possible criminal fraud. Your adoptive parents have been stealing from your inheritance while filing reports claiming the money was being spent on your behalf. We have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges if you're willing to proceed with prosecution. The conversation continued for an hour, during which Patricia explained that other family members might also be involved in the fraud. Victoria's expensive lifestyle and education had been funded by withdrawals from my trust fund that were documented as my living expenses, even though I'd never received any of the money. The Chens had been using my inheritance to pay for her life while making me feel guilty for not contributing enough to family expenses. Ms. Morrison, I need to ask you directly. Did you know about the inheritance? Did your adoptive parents ever mention that you had a trust fund from your biological parents? No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They never told me I was adopted. I didn't know my biological parents existed, let alone that they'd left me money. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several minutes before Patricia spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. Ms. Morrison, what your adoptive parents did to you constitutes multiple felonies. They've stolen your inheritance, hidden your identity, and defrauded the trust that was established to protect your future. You have grounds for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery of damages. I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by evidence of a deception that had shaped my entire life, finally understanding why I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment, a spacious 2-bedroom in a building with actual amenities, paid for with money recovered from my trust fund, when Victoria called for the first time since the criminal charges had been filed against our adoptive parents. The conversation I'd been dreading had finally arrived, and I found myself strangely calm as I answered the phone. Isabella, Victoria said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I need to talk to you about what's happening with Mom and Dad. Margaret and Richard Chen were facing multiple felony charges for trust fund fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The criminal investigation had revealed the full scope of their deception, including falsified documents, intercepted legal correspondence, and systematic theft that had spanned nearly a decade. I know this is hard for you, I replied, settling into the comfortable chair I'd been able to afford once I'd stopped funding other people's lifestyles. But Victoria, they stole my inheritance and lied to me about my identity for 28 years. They deserve to face consequences for what they did. But they raised us, Victoria said, apparently struggling to reconcile her emotional attachment to the Chens with the legal reality of their crimes. They loved us and took care of us. Doesn't that count for something? The question revealed how differently we'd experienced our childhood with the Chens. Victoria had been genuinely loved and spoiled, treated as their biological daughter and protected from any knowledge of the family's financial dysfunction. I'd been treated as a source of labor and income, valued for my contributions rather than loved for my existence. They raised you, I corrected gently. They exploited me while making me believe I was part of a family that never actually existed. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the distinction between being raised with love versus being raised for utility. Isabella, I want you to know that I didn't know about the inheritance. I really believed Mom and Dad were paying for everything, and when I found out you'd been supporting us, I was genuinely shocked. I believe you, I said, and I did. Victoria had been a victim of the Chen's deception too, though her victimization had taken the form of being protected from reality rather than being exploited by it. James and I have been talking about how to make this right, Victoria continued. We want to pay you back for the wedding expenses, and for anything else we benefited from that was actually your money. The offer was generous, but it missed the fundamental point of what had happened to our family. Victoria, the money isn't the real issue anymore. The real issue is that I spent my entire adult life believing I was part of a family that was willing to exploit me while making me feel guilty for not being generous enough. But we are family, Victoria protested. Maybe not by blood, but we grew up together. We have shared memories and experiences. That has to count for something. I'd been in therapy for months, working through the complex emotions of discovering that my entire identity had been constructed around a lie. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that families were defined by how they treated each other, not by genetic relationships or shared history. Victoria, I love you, but I can't continue relationships that are based on the expectation that I'll financially support people who don't respect or appreciate me. I need to build a life based on authentic connections, rather than obligation and guilt. What does that mean for us? It means we can have a relationship if you want one, but it has to be a relationship between equals, rather than between a provider and a beneficiary. I'm not going to be the family ATM anymore, and I'm not going to accept being treated as stingy or selfish when I'm not willing to fund other people's lifestyle choices. Victoria was crying now, apparently realizing that the family dynamic she'd grown up with was ending permanently. Isabella, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for how we treated you, and how long it took me to understand what was really happening. I accept your apology, I said honestly, but apologies don't undo 28 years of exploitation. I need to see changes in behavior, not just expressions of regret. The criminal case against the Chens was proceeding slowly through the court system, but the civil recovery of my trust fund had been swift and comprehensive. Patricia Williams had negotiated a settlement that returned the stolen money plus interest and penalties, providing me with enough financial security to completely rebuild my life. More importantly, I'd learned my real name, found photographs of my biological parents, and discovered that I came from a family of software engineers and teachers who'd valued education, creativity, and financial responsibility. I was part of a legacy of people who'd worked hard and planned for the future, rather than people who'd exploited others to fund their immediate gratification. "There's something else I need to tell you," I said to Victoria. "I'm moving to Portland next month. I got a job offer from a company that develops financial literacy software, and I want to start fresh somewhere that doesn't have memories of being lied to and taken advantage of." "Portland?" "Isabella, that's across the country. It's far enough away that I won't be tempted to fall back into old patterns of family dysfunction," I replied, "and close enough that you can visit if you want to build a real relationship based on honesty and mutual respect." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment looking at the photographs of my biological parents that Patricia had provided, 2 young software engineers who died believing they were protecting their daughter's future, never imagining that their carefully planned inheritance would be stolen by the people they'd trusted to care for me. Their daughter was finally free to build the life they'd hoped for, funded by the inheritance they'd provided, and guided by the values they'd embodied. It had taken 28 years, but Isabella Morrison was finally coming home to herself.